Perfect. Today, my guest is Professor Elizabeth Rose. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Elizabeth as a person. Professor Rose is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Rose is an AIB Fellow, and she was also the Secretary-Treasurer of Fellows of the AIB until recently. She was the past chair of International Management Division at AOM and AIB's-Oceania chapter. Elizabeth served as the Vice President for Administration for AIB. She was the founding chair of AIB's Australia and New Zealand chapter, now AIB's-Oceania. She is a past president of both Australia and New Zealand International Business Academy and the Association of Japanese Business Studies. She's been a chair of the SMS's Global Strategy Interest Group and chair of the AOM's International Management Division. She serves on editorial boards of AJBS, Global Strategy Journal, Management International Review, and Thunderbird International Business Review. She is a co-editor of Academy of Management Collections and Review of International Business and Strategy. She was named the Woman of the Year 2019 by the Woman of AIB, the WAIB. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Oh, thank you, guys, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Perfect. Elizabeth, what did you want to become when you were a child?
I think for much of my childhood, I wanted to be a teacher, ironically. But I actually thought I was going to teach elementary school. I thought it would be so cool to teach kids how to read, that it was something really important to do. And then I decided I wanted to work for the United Nations.
Interesting. So where did you grow up?
I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in Manhattan and grew up on Long Island.
Interesting. And can you pinpoint the earliest moment of, or there's international, there's domestic difference? Can you pinpoint the difference?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. And I think it was probably my grandparents, when I was very young, did a lot of traveling, and they would, sounds tacky now, but it was really kind of neat. They would bring back dolls in native dress from wherever they were. So I had this large collection in my bedroom of dolls in, traditional dress from a whole bunch of places. And I think that's probably the first time I realized that, not everything's the United States. So I was sort of, I hadn't thought about those for ages and ages, but I think that was probably it.
Very nice. And how did you choose the field, IB, and academia in general?
Academia in general, I think it was pretty clear, when I was an undergrad, that I probably wanted to be an academic. I did work for several years for Ford Motor Company and learned very quickly that I was not a corporate America kind of girl. I grew up in the context of a small family firm, and it was kind of daunting to realize that I had had much more impact on that firm, influence on that firm when I was 16 than I was ever going to have at Ford Motor Company. So after a few years, I went back to get a PhD, and the thing that kind of cracks me up thinking back on it was my friends from undergrad were asking, what are you doing a PhD in? Because I tend to have broad interests, either eclectic or lacking in focus, depending on whether you ask my husband or me. I go with eclectic. And so I started a PhD actually I did a master's and then started a PhD in civil engineering, structural engineering, and then switched into the business school. So I think I've kind of always been an academic at heart. I'm glad I had a few years in business, but I think academia is kind of where I belong.
Beautiful. Elizabeth, something that's not on your CV that people would find interesting about you?
Me, interesting. I think one thing that okay, I don't know if I don't know if it's interesting, but it made a big difference to me. I think I was in one of the early classes at Princeton that was coeducational. So, and I think that shaped the way I view a lot of things. I mean, Princeton shaped the way I view a lot of things, full stop. But I think that I was, having had that experience, and it also made me somewhat more interested in, ex post rationalizing, I suspect, but in organizations, because this was an organization that was going through a massive transformation. It had been all male for a couple centuries more, and suddenly they did a wonderful job, really, of integrating women, and make it in the 4 years I was there, it pretty well went from being an all male institution that had a few women to being quite co-ed. So I think I find that interesting. I don't know if anybody else will.
Oh, it is interesting. Now, the houses that you lived in there, like, did have interesting names. What was yours?
Oh, well, actually, I predated most of the residential colleges.
Okay.
I'm old. I lived
Okay.
in one that was then called Wilson College, but is no longer. But they've recently renamed that. But yeah, I mostly just lived I lived in 4 different dormitories, mostly
Beautiful.
named after, at one point, wealthy alumni, I suspect.
Who was the most famous scholar you met when you were taking courses there? Everyone has a Nobel there, right? Everyone
Well,
has one or
everyone.
will get one.
I think it was probably, I had a class from Burton Malkiel.
Oh, yeah?
So for our field, he would have been the most famous person, I think.
Interesting.
But it was an amazing opportunity, and I didn't take nearly enough advantage of it.
If you stop doing what you're doing today, what's the second best alternative career path for you?
Oh dear. I mean, something realistic or something I wish I had done?
You wish you had done.
I keep coming back to wishing I'd done something like the Peace Corps, that I could actually go and really make a difference to people. I mean, I think, in our way, we make a difference to people, but, sort of not at a very fundamental level. So I think I'd probably have wished to have done some sort of development aid work.
I need to look it up, but is there something like a Teachers Without Borders? Like something similar to Doctors Without Borders? Yeah, maybe you should think about that one.
Yeah.
Regrets, have you got any?
Oh, don't we all? Yeah, right now, I regret the fact that I haven't seen my husband in over a year, but I'm hoping to get home soon. Regrets, I think I don't read enough. I have not taken advantage of so many opportunities. And, we're all really busy. So it's not like I sit around doing nothing, but I look back and think, I really wish that I had made better use of the opportunities that I had in front of me. But I mean, I've had a really weird career path. And I've thought about it, and I actually don't regret any of the strange choices I've made, because I think they were the right choices at the time. Ex post, I probably would have made a couple of different choices,
Sure,
but I think, given the information that I had at the time, they were the right moves.
What did you learn from your biggest failure?
Oh, my biggest failure, goodness, there's so many. Think I've learned to just keep going. I'm not someone who believes terribly strongly in herself most of the time, but I think the experience of sort of picking yourself up after a massive failure, which involved qualifying exams, in my first go at a PhD, the fact that I didn't just quit and give up on my dream, I think that sort of sticks with me.
And your passion, what are you most passionate about?
Okay, I'm a nerd. I don't have a huge life outside of work. I think something I really love in terms of, the job is working with doctoral students and younger scholars and having them come back afterwards and say, you made a difference here. That drives me.
And can I ask you about the 2019 Woman of the Year Award and Woman in AIB or WAIB? What did you feel when you got that award?
That was amazing to me, because I actually picked up the email telling me that I was being given this award after an event with alumni or students, probably students. I was taking a late train back to my apartment from Leeds, and I actually started tearing up. It was just remarkable. I never expected it. And I think what I realized at that point was people who'd received that award before me were Lorraine Eaton, Rosalie Tung, and Nakia Boyachigilar, which I don't say properly, but we all know Nakia anyway. And I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm in this group with these amazing people. So that I actually have the certificate sitting on my wall, hanging on my wall right in front of me. And it just makes me smile every single time.
Perfect. And last question in the personal segment, what's your biggest accomplishment that you feel, the minute you think about it, you feel, I have accomplished it?
That shouldn't be this hard, should it? I think it actually is seeing younger scholars that I've mentored or given advice to having success. I think that's amazing. It means a tremendous amount to me. I've had some students who are doing well, and I've done a lot. I do a lot of paper development workshops in India with the AIB India and AIB Africa chapters. And when someone writes to me and says, thank you so much, I've just had this paper published, which is very, very meaningful to them. It makes my heart feel good.
Thank you. About research, first question I'm asking everyone, I'm putting it in a context like you're stranded in a small village, no one knows you. But the point is, how do you explain your research to people who don't read you regularly? And how do you explain the importance of your research? What do you say?
I tell them I'm interested that the work I do looks at how firms internationalize. And I look at various aspects of that. And I'm particularly interested in firms from emerging markets and firms in the service sector. But how do firms take decisions about internationalizing, and how do they actually go about doing it?
Mm-hmm. And talking about omitted variables in IB research or understudied areas in IB, can you identify some contexts or topics in IB that we need to study more?
Oh, this is the beauty of IB. There's always more to study. I think we need to do, I'm delighted to see that more and more people are looking at sort of the international entrepreneurship area, because I think that most of what we understand in IB is based on large firms, particularly from North America and Europe. And I think we don't understand yet what the differences and what the similarities are. I mean, there are going to be a lot of similarities, for firms from India or various parts of Africa that internationalize, but there are also some important distinctions. And I don't think we've sussed that out well enough yet. Mm-hmm. And I also think we don't pay attention to the decision-making process and how decisions are actually taken. I'm very guilty of writing in quite a few papers, the firm decided to do this. And actually, firms don't decide to do things; people decide to do things. And I don't think in IB we've quite gotten there yet. I think we still make a lot of assumptions about what's happening based on what we can observe, because it's hard to get the data.
Sure.
So I think we need to go into more depth and maybe not try to generalize as much. Really understand deeply what's happening, and then try to make sense of it.
Yep. And about creativity in scholarship, how do you define it? And what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of idle curiosity?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I haven't been flying enough recently to have states of idle curiosity. When you live in New Zealand and work in the UK, you get lots of long haul flights, and I actually look forward to them because they're sort of quiet time. Used to, but let's see, what do I think about creativity? I don't think of myself as being terribly creative. I think I'm good at implementing research. I'm good at framing ideas and framing research papers. I don't think of myself as creative though. And that's in research, that's in everything. You know, some people can envision how things are going to look in the early stages. I really can't. But I think in terms of, sorry, what was the question? I think I've lost it now.
About creativity, like how do people come up with these great, interesting research questions? What does the mind think of? Where do they get inspiration from, right? So, for example, my mentor says, like, I would go to the Yale library and pick up a book, any book about any topic. I would read it. I would get some idea. Everyone gets it differently, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably for me, it's probably more about seeing something that a firm has done and wondering why. I think it's, you know, I don't think of myself as I'm not very strong in theory. I'm good in testing theory, but I don't think I'm great at developing theory. So for me, it's more about trying to make sense of what I'm observing.
Where do you see the next 5 to 10 years? But what's the next big question in IB? So if let me reword it differently. If a PhD student comes to you in a doctoral consortium and she wants to get some idea about what to work on, and you say, oh, this is the next 5 years of the field, you should be working on such and such area. Usually people say you should work on a topic that you feel very passionate about. Yeah, that is the correct answer. I know that one. But at the end of the day, there must be a paper on one topic, it's a dissertation, very narrowly defined. What is the next 5 to 10 years of the field going to be as a big research question?
I would say, yeah, I think we have a lot to do about understanding emerging markets. I think I think we're starting to understand about some emerging markets, but I think there are emerging and developing markets that are fascinating that we in IB have not started to touch. We see very, very little research that deals with internationalization in the African context. And I get Africa's a continent, not a country, but in IB, we don't pay much attention to internationalizing to or from Africa. And I think that's something that we need to do more full stop and more effectively. I think we are still at the stage of making some grand assumptions about emerging market firms. And as soon as you start looking into these firms, there's huge variation. And I don't think we understand that yet. So I think both of those areas, we've got a lot of work to do, a lot of work still to do.
China is making a huge investment in Africa with Belt and Road initiatives, big infrastructure investments. How is that going to impact research?
Well, I mean, I think it's fascinating to study. I mean, I think China in itself is fascinating to study. It's not my area of expertise at all. I don't think that we can generalize what Chinese firms and the Chinese government do particularly. But that's fine with me. I think understanding what's going on is fine, even if we can't generalize. I think it opens up lots of opportunities for business in Africa. It also presents quite a few challenges.
Okay. And about the evolution of IB culture from the past, the current, and to the future, how are we evolving? The field is evolving, in your opinion?
Oh, I think it's becoming much more wide open. Like many people of my era, I didn't study IB. I came to IB from a different field. And one of the things that struck me initially was how welcoming people were in the IB field. Mm-hmm. And, in other fields, they'd kind of go, oh, you don't have a PhD in our area. And in IB, it was kind of like, wow, you're interested in our problems, come on in. And I'd like to think that IB is still very welcoming. I think what's fascinating is we see a lot more diversity in terms of where people are, where people have come from, but even, where they're located now. If you look at, who was publishing in JIBS 30 years ago versus now, it's much more diversity. And I think that's wonderful. And I think what that also does is it offers us all opportunities to make interesting connections. I did a lot of my early work looking at Japanese firms, and that had nothing to do with what I knew. I don't speak Japanese, but I was working with Kiyohiko Ito, who kind of is the one who introduced me to IB. And he obviously has deep understanding of the Japanese context. So, that linkage, that connection, which we made in our PhD program, it had a huge impact on my research and on my career path. And I think this greater diversity gives us all lots of opportunities to do that sort of thing.
Beautiful.
I like working with other people most of the time.
Elizabeth, I mean, you're very active in SMS, Academy of Management, and AIB. About the IB culture or research or scholarship, do you see the differences between these three constituents?
I do. Now, my research tends to sit sort of at the intersection of IB and strategy. So that's all a pretty natural fit to me. I think, there's huge overlap in the global strategy interest group for SMS, the AIB, and the International Management Division. So, you see a lot of the same faces at each conference, which is wonderful. It's kind of why we go to these things. I think it's the organizations are different, though. I think the SMS is, it's much more strategy. It's a bit more, the issues, the questions that are being discussed, at the conference in general, and that filters down into the into each of the interest groups. They're a bit more different. They're a bit more different. Oh, that was terrible English. They're a bit different. We worry about performance a lot more in the Academy of Management, International Management Division. There's a better mix of strategy, of micro and macro. And AIB is fascinating because the focus has changed a lot since I started going to the AIB, which is really cool. So I think AIB sort of covers the gamut. What fascinates me about the AIB is you'll get sort of strategy people who look at issues at firm level stuff going, oh, everything on the program is micro and cross-cultural, and the cross-cultural people make the same complaint. So it's probably hitting it right somehow.
AIB is home and full of complaints. That's right. Okay, third segment about advice and mentoring. To start it off with, who was your advisor?
My PhD is actually in statistics and management science. So my advisor was a statistician. His name was Alan Spivey at the University of Michigan.
What was the best advice you received from your mentor, your advisor?
He did a wonderful job of kind of showing me how to be a good, corporate citizen in academic terms. He was quite involved in organizations and got me involved in the American Statistical Association. I was a card-carrying member at one point. And that's had a huge impact on my career, because as you've said, I tend to get involved in a lot of associations, and I get a lot of pleasure from that.
Mm-hmm. And what do you wish you'd known when you were starting out?
Well, it would have saved me several years if I'd figured out that IB was where I wanted to be, but that's another issue. I think when I started out, I assumed that the publication process would be, this is not going to be politically correct, would be sort of more rational. And I don't mean that it's wrong, except when they reject my papers, then of course it's wrong. But I think I assumed that it was going to be a lot more rational to manage. I still struggle sometimes. And when you start to understand the process, you see that it's not this sort of, you're not having to please everybody. You're basically writing, when you submit a paper, you're writing for a very finite number of people who are the gatekeepers. And I think I didn't understand quite how that was going to work. So I try to explain that to doctoral students and junior scholars, but it probably doesn't sink in until you've tried it.
So that brings me to the next question. What are the top mistakes or most commonly made mistakes in for junior faculty, for PhD students that you see over and over?
I think when you're just starting out, unless you're in a PhD program that has good, that has strong research training, which frankly, most people don't have around the world, I think you don't realize that you actually have to craft your paper in a way that sounds like it belongs in that journal. That it's not enough to say, I have this great topic, this great data, and here's what I've done. That it actually, the writing takes a long time, and it has to be appropriate for the target journal. I think a lot of junior scholars tend to just assume that to not bother to read for style. They just read for content. But I think reading for style is really important. I think the other thing is, look, I started out in statistics and the writing was a lot easier. The work was hard. The papers were hard to do, but there are just X number of ways you can talk about a particular model. And it's not so much crafting the story. Whereas you come to IB, and now I write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and then rewrite some more. I had never done that in my life. So I think it's about the crafting the paper, and it's not about the R squareds, and it's not about the significance levels. It's crafting the paper that makes the difference. And I think most junior scholars wouldn't get that.
And connecting or extending the argument, what's the advice for how to teach or how to learn crafting a paper, how to write a paper, how to sell the idea, how to make good response letters? What are the advice that you can? Frankly, I think some people are very argumentative, very confrontational in the response letter. So some advice about how to do, what to do, and what not to do.
Okay, I think first of all, recognize that these people, even though they're not saying things you want to hear or read, have put a lot of time and effort into your paper, the reviewers. And you kind of need to appreciate that. I think we also, it's really easy, and I do this too. You think, they just didn't understand my paper. Well, actually, in fact, I didn't write it clearly enough.
Mhm.
And that's a hard thing to get your head around sometimes. So I think, yeah, in terms of a reply to the referees, you have to sound grateful, because you should be. I think you need to definitely not be argumentative. I used to joke that you have to take a deer mush for brains out of the paper, out of the response before you send it. Boy, we really are going to need to edit this. But I think you also need to think carefully about what the reviewers are saying, because even if it's something that you're not going to end up implementing in the paper, you really need to think about that's an alternative interpretation or a different perspective, and you need to acknowledge that that is a different perspective. So I tend to think of this as kind of writing it defensively, but I think we need to acknowledge that what we're doing is not an exact science. There are different ways to interpret different things. You know, I may have told what I think is a great story about a particular interpretation, but if the reviewer brings up another one, I have to at least acknowledge that and incorporate the fact that that is another way to look at it. And the other thing is that in IB, we're writing for a very broad audience. You know, if we want, we theoretically want all AIB members to read our JIBS papers, right? They won't. We want more than the AIB members, but that means that the paper has to be accessible to people from a wide range of backgrounds. We don't necessarily share a common theoretical framing or a common set of literature. And so we need to be writing in a way that is interesting to a broad audience or accessible to a broad audience, while being detailed enough to be speaking to those, that small group of people who are interested in precisely the same thing as this paper is addressing. And that's hard to do. And that's part of why it takes so much rewriting and rewriting and rewriting.
Any additional advice for maybe female colleagues or new PhD students who are really starting out very, very early? Like we're talking about the first year, second year PhD students who are female or the diversity candidates. Any advice for them?
I think, wow, the advice I'm thinking of isn't quite so specific. I think don't assume that just because somebody's name is on a paper you've read that they don't want to hear from you. I think that, put yourself out there, don't be obnoxious, of course, but, talk to people. Ask people for advice. I think, especially if if it's someone who feels as though they don't see a lot of people like them, who are on the faculty, seek people out, ask for advice. One of the things that my advisor was great about was encouraging me to go to the annual American Statistical Association conference, even though I was never funded. And that was really good because I got to see, I got to learn a lot. I got to go to lots of sessions, and I got to learn, I got to see people and meet people, and you could talk to people about your research. And you could figure out pretty quickly that, especially when you're a doctoral student or a junior scholar, everybody's been there, and people are pretty happy to give advice and to help. I think, don't be afraid to ask somebody for help. I'm happy if people send me papers. I can't always get to them very quickly, and sometimes they fall off my radar completely. But I'm happy to, if I have the spare capacity, I'm really happy to do a quick read of a paper and give somebody some advice. And I think a lot of people, and myself included, I struggle to say, oh, can I have a few hours of your time? But the fact is, if somebody can't do it, they'll tell me, or else they don't answer.
To people who are watching this, it's now an open invitation. Elizabeth Rose is waiting for your emails. She's going to Thank
I'll
you.
get you for this, Ilgaz.
Okay, last question. What is one question that I should have asked you but haven't? And this is a trick question.
Oh no, a trick question. I think probably what do you really like about IB?
What do you like about IB?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to do that. I think IB it's a very broad field. I can't see us. I mean, I know there are questions, is IB running out of steam? I don't think it is. I think it's a pretty young field, and there are just so many aspects of how and why and where firms internationalize that we don't understand. I mean, I know we all tend, obviously when I've written a paper that has results, I think these are brilliant results and they of course apply everywhere. But in fact, if you look, we're usually explaining, 25% of the variation in the dependent variable. We have a ton to learn, and there are lots of different ways to learn that. I think, and this will sound strange coming from a primarily quant person, I think we need to encourage, even more than we already are, good, deep, qualitative research and value it, because I've been involved with some colleagues doing interviews with firms in India during, post-COVID. And it's incredible how much you learn from talking to managers. CK Prahalad used to tell me, Beth, you need to get out there and talk to managers. And I kind of went, yeah, sure, CK. Yeah, he was right. Because you just learn an amazing amount of stuff.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your time for this great interview. I learned a lot. I know the audience will agree with me. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ilgaz. This was really fun. And thank you for taking on this project. It's a real contribution. And I know I'm enjoying seeing the other interviews. So thank you.